The Arctic is a world where survival is a constant battle, where the wind bites like icy needles and the land stretches endlessly in every direction. The snow, thick and unyielding, blankets everything it touches, concealing the secrets of the wilderness beneath its frozen surface. In this harsh environment where few animals dare to tread, there are stories that even the locals won't speak of, whispers of encounters that have left even the bravest souls shaken to their core. One such story begins with a lone cabin, standing tall against the unforgiving backdrop of the Arctic. It was a simple structure, modest with weathered wood, and a roof weighed down by the thick snow that relentlessly piled up during the long winters. Its windows, frosted over with ice, allowed only a faint glimpse of the world outside, casting everything in an eerie, ghostly glow. The cabin, despite its humble appearance, had an air of mystery, a strange aura that seemed to draw the curious and the cautious alike. It was late into the night when a soft, almost imperceptible sound reached the ears of the lone occupant inside. At first, it was barely more than the whisper of the wind, the kind of sound that could be dismissed as nature itself. But then, as the minutes ticked by, the noise began to change. It was a tap, a faint scratching at the door, followed by another. The kind of sound that sent a chill racing down the spine, one that echoed through the quiet cabin like a warning. The man inside, who had come to the Arctic for solitude and refuge from the chaos of his previous life, rose slowly from his chair by the crackling fire. His instincts, honed through years of survival in the wilderness, told him that something was off. A bear, perhaps, or some other large predator. But this was no bear. The sound was too deliberate, too cautious, almost desperate. He moved cautiously toward the door, peering out through a small window beside it. What he saw chilled him to the bone. Outside, against the blackened backdrop of the Arctic night, a lone figure stood. It was small, almost frail-looking, with fur matted against the cold. The animal seemed to be trembling, its eyes reflecting the dim light of the cabin like two gleaming orbs in the darkness. It was an Arctic fox, its coat as white as the snow that surrounded the cabin, save for the dark patches around its eyes and paws that gave it an almost otherworldly appearance. But what struck him the most was the way it moved. It wasn't the erratic, fearful shuffle of an animal on the run. No, this was different. This fox was approaching with purpose, almost as if it knew exactly where it was going, as if it understood the cabin was the only place it could seek refuge. And yet, there was a sense of desperation in its movements, something that the man couldn't shake off. The fox stopped at the door, its small form silhouetted by the pale moonlight. For a long moment, it simply stood there, staring up at the man through the frosted window. The man's heart began to race. In the Arctic, animals didn't behave like this. They were creatures of instinct, driven by hunger or the need to survive. But this fox, it felt like it was trying to tell him something, something far more profound than the simple need for shelter or food. With a shiver of uncertainty, the man opened the door a crack, just enough to peer outside. The wind howled around him, biting at his exposed skin, but the fox stood unmoving, its gaze never wavering from his. Then, just as he thought to close the door, the fox did something that no animal in the wild would do. It let out a soft, mournful whine, almost like a whisper. The man froze. He couldn't remember the last time he had heard anything like it. A sound so human, so full of sorrow and longing. His breath caught in his throat as the fox took a tentative step forward, its body trembling from the cold. It was then that he realized that it wasn't the weather that had caused the animal to be in such a state. No, something else was at play. Something that even the Arctic's harshest conditions couldn't explain. The man stood there for what felt like an eternity, unsure of what to do. Should he let the fox in, offering it the warmth and safety of the cabin, or should he send it away, trusting that it could find its way in the frozen wilderness. There was something in the fox's eyes, though, something that told him it wasn't just an animal seeking shelter. The desperation in its movements spoke of a far greater need, a need that could not be ignored. Against his better judgment, the man opened the door fully, stepping aside to allow the fox inside. The moment the fox crossed the threshold, it didn't hesitate. It darted past him and into the warmth of the cabin, its small body trembling as it sought refuge from the brutal cold outside. The man shut the door behind it, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. He watched the fox closely as it huddled in a corner, its fur matted and its body still shaking. It was clear that the animal was in distress, but why had it come to him? And more importantly, what had driven it to such an extreme state of vulnerability? The man felt the weight of the question settle heavily in the pit of his stomach, a gnawing feeling that refused to be ignored. As he sat down in his chair once more, his eyes never leaving the fox, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The fox had brought something with it, something that it had uncovered in the wilderness, something that would change everything. The air in the cabin felt thick, charged with an energy that seemed to pulse through the walls. Whatever was out there in the Arctic night, the man knew that it was drawing closer. The howling winds outside grew louder, but inside the cabin, all was still. The man waited, his heart pounding in his chest. Something told him that the answers he sought were just beyond the reach of the door, waiting to be uncovered. And the fox, it was the key to unlocking the mystery that had brought them both together on this bitterly cold night. The suspense hung in the air like a storm waiting to break, and as the minutes passed, the man felt the pull of the unknown growing stronger. Something had happened out there in the Arctic wilderness, something that had driven the fox to seek him out, and as he sat there, staring into the creature's eyes, he couldn't help but wonder, what was it that the fox had uncovered, and what would it mean for him, for them both, when the truth finally came to light? The whisper of the wind outside seemed to grow louder, almost as if it was calling to him, urging him to step into the unknown. The fox's presence was a reminder that some mysteries were too great to ignore, and now he was a part of it. The story had already begun, and there was no turning back. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls of the cabin. The Arctic night pressed against the windows, the wind howling like a lost soul caught in an eternal struggle for freedom. But inside, a strange quiet had settled, thick and suffocating. The man watched the fox as it curled into the corner, its small body trembling violently. Its eyes, dark as the night, never left him, their gaze intense and unwavering. It wasn't just fear he saw in those eyes. It was something deeper, something ancient. The warmth from the fire did little to ease the chill that had settled in his bones. The cabin, usually a place of solace and safety from the world outside, now felt like a cage. He was no longer alone. The Arctic fox had become a part of the space, and with it, an undeniable sense of tension. The animal's presence was like a warning, a prelude to something that lingered just out of sight, like a storm on the horizon, waiting to break. Minutes dragged into hours, the silence hanging heavy in the air. The fox had stopped trembling, but its eyes remained locked on the man. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for something, something it expected him to do, something that was bound to happen next. The unease gnawed at him, the sense that the fox's arrival was no accident. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice cutting through the stillness like a knife. "What happened out there, little one?" His voice trembled slightly, but not from the cold. He had never been the superstitious type, nor one to believe in signs or omens. But the situation was beginning to feel far too strange to ignore. "What made you come to me?" The fox didn't move, didn't respond. It simply stared at him, its dark eyes reflecting the firelight as if it were contemplating the answer itself. There was an eerie stillness in the air, as though the world outside the cabin had stopped, holding its breath, waiting for the next move. The man stood up, his legs stiff from sitting too long, and crossed the room. He knelt down in front of the fox, his hand outstretched in an attempt to comfort the creature. But as he did, a sudden sharp noise sliced through the air, a scratch, just like the one at the door earlier. This time, it was louder, closer. The sound came from the far side of the cabin, where the walls met the shadows. The man froze, his hand hovering inches above the fox's fur. The air in the room seemed to grow colder still, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that he could see his breath hanging in the air like mist. A shiver ran down his spine, his skin prickling with a primal sense of danger. He stood up quickly, heart racing, and scanned the room. There was nothing there, only the shadows clinging to the corners, stretching and warping as the firelight danced across the room. Yet the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edges of his perception, was overwhelming. The fox, however, did not seem alarmed. Instead, it seemed to grow more tense, its eyes widening as it turned toward the source of the sound. It raised its head, ears twitching, its body stiffened. The man's breath caught in his throat as he watched the fox, realizing with a sudden clarity that it wasn't afraid of him. No, it was afraid of something else. A low growl rumbled from the shadows, barely audible but unmistakable. It was not the sound of any animal the man knew. The growl was deep, guttural and alien, like something ancient that had been disturbed from its slumber. The man's pulse quickened. He took a hesitant step toward the sound, his eyes searching the darkened corners of the cabin. But as he approached, the growl stopped abruptly. The cabin fell into a heavy silence again, only broken by the sound of the wind howling outside. "Is this some kind of trick?" the man muttered to himself, though he didn't believe his own words. There was nothing trickish about the cold terror creeping into his chest. It felt real. It felt otherworldly. And then the fox did something that stopped him in his tracks. It stood, its body low to the ground, muscles tense like a coiled spring. Its ears were flattened, and it stared directly into the shadows from which the growl had come. It was watching something, waiting for something to appear. The man followed the fox's gaze, but saw nothing. Another growl, louder this time. It was coming from the farthest corner, just beyond the door leading to the small storage room that housed the tools and supplies for the cabin. The man felt his blood run cold. Something was in the cabin with them, something that had been waiting just out of sight. He glanced quickly at the fox, whose posture had changed entirely. No longer the trembling creature seeking warmth, it had become an alert sentinel, its eyes sharp and its body poised. The man swallowed hard, his throat dry. He reached for the rifle that hung by the door, a rifle he'd always kept for protection, never truly believing he'd need it in such a remote place. But as his hand closed around the cold steel, something in the air shifted. The growling stopped again, replaced by an unsettling silence that made every nerve in his body stand on edge. For a moment, it felt as if time itself had frozen, the world outside holding its breath, as if the Arctic itself were waiting to see what would happen next. The man moved slowly, cautiously, toward the storage room door. The fox followed him, its body close to the ground, eyes locked on the corner. With each step, the silence grew thicker, the air colder, and the growl, or whatever it was, seemed to press closer, creeping up on him from behind, whispering in the back of his mind. He reached the door and hesitated. Should he open it? What if there was something waiting inside? What if whatever had made the noise was worse than anything he could imagine? He glanced down at the fox. Its eyes were wide, almost pleading. It was as if the animal knew the answer, knew the danger that lay ahead, and yet still chose to stand beside him. A soft, rhythmic scratching sound echoed once again from the corner, but this time it was not from the shadows. It came from inside the walls. It was like the sound of claws, sharp and deliberate, dragging against wood. The man took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the rifle. He turned the handle of the door slowly, the wood creaking in protest. For a moment, nothing happened. The door remained shut, but then, as he pushed it open, a fraction of an inch, a gust of cold air rushed past him. He caught a glimpse of something just beyond the door. A pair of glowing eyes, bright and predatory, locked onto his, and that was when the real terror began. The fox lunged forward, teeth bared, a feral snarl escaping its throat as it darted past him and toward the darkness in the room. The man's heart raced as he followed, the rifle raised, his breath coming in shallow gasps. What was in that room, and why had the fox reacted with such violence? But before he could enter the storage room, a sudden, bone-chilling sound pierced the air, a shriek, a cry so otherworldly, so filled with agony, that it froze him in place. Whatever had been waiting in the shadows had revealed itself, and now the man and the fox were not alone. The hunt had begun. The shriek echoed through the cabin, its guttural pitch reverberating off the wooden walls, leaving a strange buzzing in the man's ears. He could feel the tremor of the air as the noise seemed to seep into every corner of the small space. It wasn't the scream of a wild animal, nor the cry of any creature he'd ever heard before. It was something primal, something born from a place deeper than the Arctic wilderness itself, a sound that spoke of darkness and hunger, of something ancient and forgotten. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end as the sound clawed at his sanity, forcing him to step back, his hands trembling around the rifle. The fox, however, was not deterred. In fact, it seemed to feed off the shriek, its body coiled low to the ground, ears pressed against its head, eyes wide and filled with an intensity that the man had never seen before. The animal's movements were fluid and precise, its sleek white fur cutting through the dimly lit cabin as it darted toward the source of the shriek, the shadowy corner that now felt like the mouth of some terrible beast waiting to swallow them whole. The man stood frozen, his mind racing, but his legs refusing to move. What was it? What had made that sound? And why had the fox reacted with such violent urgency? The answer lingered just beyond his grasp, like a nightmare he couldn't escape. His instincts screamed at him to run, to leave the cabin, but something deep inside told him that escape was no longer an option. He had crossed into something far darker than he could have ever imagined. The growl returned, but this time it was not distant. It was right there, in the room with him. It rumbled through the walls, vibrating the floor beneath his feet, so low and menacing that it seemed to shake him to his very core. The fox, undeterred by the noise, pressed on, its small form a stark contrast to the vast shadow that loomed just ahead. As the man's eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw it, the outline of something large, something massive, moving just beyond the doorframe. It was a creature of nightmares, a hulking figure with glowing eyes that pierced through the gloom like twin lanterns. The creature's body was long and twisted, with limbs that were far too long, and a hulking frame that seemed to be made of darkness itself. It slithered, crawling low to the ground, its movement unnaturally fluid, as if it were not bound by the normal laws of nature. The man's heart pounded in his chest, his blood running cold as he realized what was standing before him. He had heard the stories, the myths whispered by the locals in hushed tones, but he had never truly believed in them. But now, in the face of this creature, the truth could no longer be denied. It was a wraith, an ancient, predatory spirit said to haunt the coldest, most desolate parts of the world. The stories spoke of its ability to cross between the realms, slipping through cracks in the fabric of reality, seeking out the warmth of life only to consume it, leaving nothing but hollowed-out shells in its wake. The fox lunged again, faster than the man could react, its sharp claws scraping against the floorboards as it closed in on the wraith. Its body arched with deadly grace as it leapt for the creature's exposed neck. But the wraith moved too quickly, too fluidly. With an eerie screech it twisted its form, extending unnaturally long limbs that reached out, grabbing the fox in mid-air. The man gasped in horror, his breath catching in his throat as he saw the fox's small body squirm in the creature's grasp. The wraith's limbs were like tendrils of darkness, black as the night, pulling the fox closer to its mouth. A maw of impossibly sharp teeth, rows upon rows of jagged, glistening fangs. The man barely had time to react before the fox was drawn into the wraith's grasp, its cries of pain and terror piercing the stillness of the cabin. "No!" The man's voice tore from his throat in a desperate shout. His legs moved on their own, propelled by the primal fear surging through his veins. He raised the rifle, the weight of it heavy in his hands, and aimed for the creature that had its fangs buried in the fox's flesh. The wraith's eyes, glowing a sickly yellow, flicked toward him. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, time itself holding its breath. The creature's gaze met his with a chilling intelligence, as if it understood that it was being hunted. It opened its mouth wide, releasing a low, deep growl that seemed to resonate through the very walls of the cabin. Without hesitation, the man squeezed the trigger. The rifle's loud report shattered the silence, the deafening sound echoing through the cabin like a clap of thunder. The bullet flew toward the wraith, but to his horror, it seemed to pass right through the creature's body, leaving no mark, no sign of injury. The wraith did not flinch, did not recoil. It was as if the bullet had simply disappeared into thin air. The man's mind raced. He had to think. He had to find a way to stop this thing. The rifle was useless. He reached for his knife instead, pulling it from the sheath at his side. The cold steel in his hand felt like a pitiful defense against the horrors before him, but it was all he had. The fox, still trapped in the wraith's grasp, was weakening. Its eyes were wide with terror, its body limp, but it continued to struggle, trying to break free. The man's heart ached, a mix of guilt and determination flooding him. The fox had led him to this point. It had sought his help, and now it was counting on him to save them both. "Get away from it!" he shouted, though his voice trembled with fear. With one swift movement, the wraith turned its attention back to the man, its dark limbs extending toward him with terrifying speed. The air grew colder, more oppressive, as the creature's presence seemed to grow stronger. The temperature inside the cabin dropped so drastically that the man could see his own breath hanging in the air like mist. Just as the wraith's tendrils reached out to ensnare him, the fox let out a blood-curdling howl. It wasn't a cry of pain, but a call that echoed through the cabin, reverberating deep into the walls, into the very earth beneath the cabin. The sound seemed to tear through the veil between the realms, a desperate plea that held the weight of the unknown. In an instant, the wraith froze, its tendrils faltered, its glowing eyes widening with an almost confused expression. The man didn't know what had happened or why, but he knew he couldn't waste the opportunity. He lunged forward, brandishing the knife in his hand, aiming for the creature's twisted form. His heart raced as he neared, closing the distance between himself and the creature that had haunted his every step since that night. Then, without warning, the air cracked like thunder, a pulse of raw energy exploding outward from the wraith's body. The force sent the man stumbling backward, his knife flying from his hand. The cabin's walls trembled, and the temperature dropped even further, plunging the room into an almost unbearable cold. The wraith screeched, its shape flickering as if it were made of smoke. For a brief moment, it seemed to waver between dimensions, as if unsure of where it truly belonged. The man, dazed and disoriented, tried to recover, his chest heaving with the effort. But before he could fully comprehend what was happening, the fox's howl grew louder, and this time, it wasn't a cry of desperation. It was a command, a signal, a final act of defiance. The wraith began to fade, its form disintegrating like dust in the wind. The dark tendrils dissolved into the air, vanishing as if they had never existed, and in that moment, The cabin fell silent once more, but the silence was different now. It wasn't empty. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the quiet before the storm. Something had shifted. The room was still, save for the quiet crackling of the fire and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the man. His heart pounded in his chest, the beat erratic, as if his body was still trying to catch up to the terror he had just witnessed. The rifle lay forgotten on the floor, its metal cold and lifeless, a useless relic in the face of the nightmare that had nearly consumed him. His eyes darted between the darkened corners of the cabin, expecting the wraith to materialize again, but nothing came. The oppressive chill that had filled the space had receded, leaving only an eerie calm in its wake. The fox, its body still trembling but now alert, stared at the man, its large eyes flicking back and forth as if it were searching for something. Its coat, which had once gleamed like fresh snow, was now dulled with the grime of the struggle. The air in the cabin felt heavier, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the next move. The fox's quiet whine broke the silence, its gaze fixed on the man, urging him, imploring him to understand. For a moment, the man remained frozen, his mind swirling with confusion. What had just happened? What was that thing? And why had it appeared in his cabin, out of nowhere with such malicious intent? His thoughts spun in circles, unable to land on a coherent answer. The story that had unfolded before him felt like something out of a nightmare, but the pain in the fox's eyes, the terror in its shrieks, told him that it had all been too real. The fox let out a soft whimper again, its voice barely audible over the crackling fire. The man's breath fogged in the cold air as he moved cautiously toward it, hesitant but driven by an instinct that told him he needed to know the truth. "You're not just some random fox, are you?" he whispered, more to himself than to the animal. It felt strange, talking to a creature that had just moments ago been involved in a battle with something so far beyond the natural world. Yet, in the silence that stretched between them, the man knew that there was a connection, something deeper, more meaningful than the simple need for shelter. The fox shifted, its eyes still locked onto him. It seemed to acknowledge his words, but it wasn't enough. There was something more it needed to convey. With a soft grunt, it began to move toward the center of the room, its steps slow, measured, as if it were guiding the man towards something important. Reluctantly, the man followed. His mind still raced, filled with the echoes of the wraith's chilling scream and the impossibility of what had just transpired. His eyes never left the fox as it led him across the cabin, its small form a stark contrast to the growing dread in the pit of his stomach. The animal stopped in front of a narrow gap in the wall, a crack that the man had never noticed before. The crack was almost imperceptible, just a small seam between the wooden planks, barely large enough to fit a hand through. The fox pawed at the crack with its small claws, its eyes flicking up to the man as if urging him to understand. The man knelt down, his heart hammering in his chest, and pressed his fingers into the gap. The wood felt strangely warm, almost as if it were alive, and as he pushed, the crack widened slightly. He felt a shiver race down his spine, but there was no turning back now. The fox's determined gaze kept him focused, its presence somehow giving him the courage to press on. The moment the crack widened enough, the man pulled at the wood, revealing a hidden compartment beneath the cabin's floor. The space beneath was dark, cold, and filled with the faint scent of damp earth. Whilst the man's eyes adjusted to the dim light, he could make out the shape of something long and narrow buried in the dirt beneath the floorboards. With trembling hands, he reached down and pulled it free. It was a box, a small old chest, its surface worn with age, its edges frayed from time and neglect. The metal clasps had long since rusted, but the wood still felt solid, unyielding. He could sense the weight of it, not just in terms of mass, but in the way it seemed to hold the air around it, as if it were hiding something that had been locked away for a reason. something dangerous. The fox moved to his side, nudging the box with its nose, its eyes watching the man intently. He hesitated for a moment, a twinge of fear creeping into his chest. Was this the answer? Was this what the creature had been guarding, the source of its distress? He swallowed hard, then, with one last glance at the fox, he carefully opened the box. Inside, nestled in layers of brittle cloth, was a small artifact, a pendant, glinting softly in the dim light. It was made of what looked like bone, carved intricately with symbols the man did not recognize. The pendant seemed to pulse, faintly, as if it were alive, as if it were calling to him, drawing him in. The markings on it twisted and curled in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic, beckoning him to reach out and touch it. The moment his fingers brushed against the pendant, the world around him seemed to shift. The warmth in the room seemed to flicker and fade, and the air grew heavy, dense with the weight of something ancient, something dark. The fire in the hearth sputtered, casting erratic shadows that danced unnaturally across the walls. A low hum filled the air, resonating deep within his chest, yan vibrating in the very bones of the cabin. The fox let out a sharp yip, its eyes wide and frantic. It darted away from the man, backing into the farthest corner of the room, its body tense with fear. It was as if the pendant had triggered something, a chain reaction that the fox had been desperately trying to prevent. The man pulled his hand back, his breath quickening as he stared at the artifact. It was no longer just a simple pendant. It was a key to something far older, far more dangerous than he could comprehend. The wraith had not been a random spirit. It had been drawn to the pendant, to its power, to the ancient force that had been sealed away for centuries. He had opened something that should have stayed locked, and now there was no going back. The wind outside howled louder, the storm growing stronger as if it were responding to the dark energy that the pendant had unleashed. The snow outside whipped violently against the cabin's walls, its fury mirroring the chaos that now churned in the man's chest. He stood there, the pendant in his hand, feeling the weight of his mistake settling over him like an avalanche. The fox's fearful whine was drowned out by the relentless wind, but the man could hear the urgency in its voice. He had to act. He had to undo what he had just awakened before it was too late. The wraith was not gone. It was still out there, still lurking in the darkness, waiting for its next move. And now, he knew that he wasn't alone in the cabin. Something else had followed him inside, something far worse than the creature he had just fought off, something that had been waiting for this very moment. As he glanced toward the door, the shadows seemed to shift, growing longer, darker. The air grew colder still, biting at his skin like frozen fingers. He could feel it closing in, the terror creeping closer with every passing second. He had unleashed something ancient and terrible, and there was no escaping it now. The hunt had only just begun. The cabin seemed to shrink around him, the walls pressing inward as if the very structure of the place was alive, responding to the ancient force that had been released. The pendant in his hand pulsed with an eerie rhythm, its cold surface sending a chill through his bones. His heart raced as he tried to make sense of the situation, but his thoughts felt disjointed, fragmented. The wind outside howled like a furious beast, its howl twisting with something sinister, something that felt far too human. The fox, now cowering in the corner, continued to watch him, its body low to the ground, trembling with fear. It was no longer the fierce, defiant creature that had stood its ground against the wraith. It was a creature broken, aware of the danger they were in, yet powerless to stop it. The man's mind whirled with panic. The pendant was no longer just an artifact. It was the key to a nightmare. And in his desperate curiosity, he had set something in motion that he might never be able to stop. He could feel it now, a presence, something intangible but undeniably there. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the room, curling into shapes that shouldn't exist, as if the darkness itself was alive. The temperature dropped even further, until the man could see his breath clouding in front of him, his fingers numb with cold. The warmth of the fire in the hearth flickered and sputtered, its flames growing smaller, weaker, as if even the flame itself feared the dark force that was creeping into the cabin. With trembling hands, the man placed the pendant back into the box, as though trying to seal away the evil that it had unleashed. But as soon as his fingers touched the box, a jolt of electricity shot through him, sending him sprawling back onto the floor. His head cracked against the wooden boards, and for a moment, everything went black. When his vision cleared, the cabin was different. The walls had faded into shadow, the floorboards warped and twisted, as if the very space around him had begun to distort. The fire was now a faint glow in the distance, and the once warm, safe confines of the cabin now felt like a hollow shell, empty and suffocating. The fox was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. Then he heard it, a low, guttural growl deep and vibrating through the floorboards, emanating from the very ground beneath him. It wasn't the same growl he had heard earlier. This one was more primal, more visceral, and it seemed to echo with a hunger so ancient it felt as though the sound had been waiting to return for centuries. The man's heart stopped. He knew, with a sudden and terrifying clarity, that the wraith was not gone. It had only retreated, waiting for the right moment to strike. A movement in the corner caught his eye. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted in the shadows. At first, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him, but then the shape began to take form. It was dark, the edges blurring in the half-light, but he could make out the unmistakable outline of something crawling, dragging itself across the floor. A figure, a silhouette. No, not a figure. It was something far worse. It was a being, an entity that existed only in the darkest corners of reality. It was a creature of nightmare, its shape an amalgamation of shadow and twisted flesh, too horrible to fully comprehend. Its limbs were impossibly long, its body unnaturally thin, stretching out like a grotesque mockery of a human form. Its face was a blur, its eyes glowing like burning coals in the darkness. The wraith, the man's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move, he could hardly think. All he could do was watch as the creature slithered closer, its eyes locked on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. It was drawing closer, faster now, its unnatural limbs scraping against the wooden floor, leaving behind streaks of blackened ash. Then, a sound broke the oppressive silence, a high-pitched screech like a banshee's wail, but colder, more chilling. It came from the shadows, from the very walls themselves. The man could feel the cabin shuddering beneath him, the walls bending and cracking as if the entire structure were succumbing to the force of whatever had been awakened. The wraith's eyes glowed brighter, and its mouth, a vast, cavernous opening lined with jagged, broken teeth, stretched wider, impossibly wide, as it emitted a shriek so loud and piercing that it felt like it was tearing at the very fabric of reality. Then the lights flickered. The fire sputtered and went out completely. The man was plunged into darkness. The shadows grew deeper, and with the darkness came a suffocating silence like the calm before the storm. The cold was unbearable now, freezing him to the core, and yet he could hear nothing but the rush of his own heartbeat in his ears. He knew that whatever was coming, whatever was stalking him, was no longer just a shadow in the dark. It was here. The wraith surged forward, its long limbs stretching toward him like claws, its glowing eyes narrowing as it closed the distance. The man scrambled to his feet, his legs weak and unsteady beneath him, and he reached for the rifle, but it was gone. The room had shifted once again. The rifle was no longer there, replaced by nothing but the biting cold and the oppressive darkness that seemed to press in from every angle. The wraith was upon him. The man could feel the air change, the temperature dropping to a level that burned his skin with its icy touch. A pulse of cold shock ran through his chest as the creature's shadow loomed over him. He tried to move, to run, but his body refused to respond. His mind screamed, but no sound came from his throat. Then a sharp, stinging pain erupted from his chest, a sensation unlike anything he had ever felt before. It was as if the wraith had reached into him, tearing through his very soul, pulling something from within him. His vision blurred, the darkness growing thicker, but before he could even process what was happening, the pain stopped. And then, just as suddenly, the pressure lifted. The wraith was gone. The man stood in the center of the cabin, alone. The air was still, deathly still, and the only sound was the wind howling outside, rattling the windows. His body trembled from the shock, his hands still gripping the air as though he could somehow still feel the presence of the creature lingering nearby. But there was no time to wonder. The pendant, he had to destroy the pendant. He had opened the door, and now he had to close it. The man's mind snapped into focus. The pendant was the key, and it was still in the box, sitting on the floor where he had left it. He stumbled toward it, his steps unsteady, and grabbed the box with shaking hands. The room had stopped shifting, but the shadows still stretched long and ominous, as though the wraith's presence was lingering, waiting for its next opportunity. The man didn't hesitate. With every ounce of strength left in him, he grabbed the pendant and flung it into the fireplace. It glowed brightly for a split second before it was consumed by the flames, and in that instant, the shadows retreated, the cold dissipated, and the world began to feel real again. But the storm raged on outside. The wraith may have been banished, for now, but the man knew one thing with certainty: the darkness was never truly gone. It was only waiting, and he had been marked. As the fire slowly died down, he slumped against the wall, his body drained and exhausted. The fox had disappeared into the night, its presence no longer felt, and in the flickering light of the dying fire, the man wondered if he would ever truly escape the shadows, or if, perhaps, the shadows had been a part of him all along. The fire was but embers now, its warmth slowly fading into the oppressive cold that had overtaken the cabin. The man could feel the silence like a weight pressing against his chest. His body ached with exhaustion, but his mind raced, unable to find the calm it so desperately craved. The storm outside had not relented. The wind howled against the cabin's walls, battering it as if trying to break through, to unleash the chaos that lay just beyond. But it wasn't the storm he feared anymore. It was what lurked in the dark. With the pendant now reduced to ash in the hearth, the man felt a flicker of hope. He had done it, hadn't he? He had destroyed the key that had unlocked the nightmare. The wraith was gone, for now at least, and the cold chill that had haunted the cabin seemed to have lifted. Yet something gnawed at the back of his mind. Something was still off. It was too quiet, too still. He rose slowly, each movement deliberate and cautious. His limbs felt heavy, as if the terror that had consumed him had sapped his very strength. The cabin seemed to grow smaller, the walls closing in on him as though they were no longer a refuge but a prison. His fingers grazed the rough wood of the wall as he made his way to the window, pulling aside the heavy curtains. The world outside was nothing but a blur of white. Snow and wind had overtaken everything, the landscape unrecognizable, blanketed under a thick, suffocating layer of winter's wrath. And yet there was something in the snow that made his blood run cold. A shape, a figure. It was too far out for him to see clearly, but he could make out the outline of something standing just at the edge of the forest where the snow seemed to swallow everything whole. It stood still, unmoving, a dark silhouette against the pale snow, as if it had always been there, waiting. His heart skipped a beat. The wraith? Impossible. He had destroyed the pendant. It should have been gone. He squinted against the storm, trying to convince himself that it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the swirling wind and snow. But the shape remained, unyielding. It was too deliberate, too precise to be a figment of his imagination. His mind screamed at him to look away, to retreat, to lock the door and bury himself in the relative safety of the cabin, but his body betrayed him. He couldn't look away. His gaze was drawn to the figure like a magnet, his every instinct telling him to flee, yet his feet remained rooted to the floor, frozen in place. Then it moved. A slow, deliberate step forward. The figure didn't walk. It glided, as if its feet didn't touch the ground. The movement was unnatural, otherworldly, like the creature was part of the storm itself, woven into the very fabric of the blizzard. The man's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't the wraith. This was something else. A new terror flooded his senses, something darker than anything he had felt before. His chest tightened, and the cold air, which had once seemed merely uncomfortable, now felt suffocating. He backed away from the window, but his legs were uncooperative, unwilling to move. The figure in the snow was coming closer, its presence seeping through the walls like a poison, and then it spoke. A sound, no louder than a whisper, but piercing through the storm, like a voice from the depths of the earth. "It's not over." The words hung in the air, unnatural, twisted, with an ancient malice that seemed to seep into his very soul. It wasn't the voice of the wraith. It was something older, something far more primal. The man's blood ran cold as he turned away from the window, stumbling backward, desperate to escape the terror that had followed him inside. The sound of the wind outside seemed to grow louder, almost deafening, as if the storm was trying to bury him alive. He ran to the door, his breath ragged, his mind screaming for escape, but when he reached for the handle, he found it frozen shut. His hand slipped off the cold metal, and panic set in. The door would not open. The storm, the creature outside, the growing weight of his own fear, it was all closing in on him. Frantically, he turned back to the room. His eyes darted from corner to corner, searching for something, anything, that might offer a solution. But the cabin was empty now. The fox was gone, its presence a fleeting memory in the shadows, and he was alone. The silence returned, but it was not the comforting kind of silence. It was a silence that crawled under his skin, that clung to the air like a blanket of frost. It was as if the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting. The shadows in the corners of the room twisted, long and thin, stretching like fingers, as if the walls were closing in on him. The air felt heavier, as if the very atmosphere was thickening with the malevolent force that had entered. His mind raced. The wraith had not been the only creature tied to the pendant. That was what he had not understood. That was the truth he had missed, the one piece of the puzzle that had eluded him in his panic. The pendant had been a prison, yes, but it had also been a beacon for something far older and far more dangerous than anything he had ever imagined. And now it had found him. It had followed him into the cabin, and there was nowhere to run. He spun around, looking for a weapon, anything that might offer a defense, but the rifle was still gone, lost in the shifting shadows. His eyes flicked to the box in the corner, the one that had once held the pendant. It sat there, its lid slightly askew, as though mocking him for his futile attempts at salvation. His fingers trembled as he reached for it, pulling it open again, desperate for something, anything, that could help him. Inside, there was nothing but dust, nothing. The box was empty. A low growl rumbled in the distance, deep and low, coming from the shadows. The wraith was not gone. It was still there, lingering in the dark corners of the cabin. He could feel it, just out of sight, just out of reach. Suddenly, a sharp noise pierced the silence, the sound of something scraping against the walls. Something was moving inside the cabin, but it wasn't the wraith. No, this sound was different. It was the sound of claws clicking against the wood, sharp and rhythmic. He turned toward the sound, his heart hammering in his chest. The shadows near the door seemed to writhe, twisting in on themselves, until they began to take shape. Slowly, from the deepest dark, something emerged, something far darker than the wraith. It was there, in the doorway, watching him. Its eyes gleamed like burning embers, glowing with a malevolence that pierced through the darkness. Its form was more twisted than anything he had seen before. It was not just a shadow, it was the very embodiment of it. The darkness had taken shape, and it was now alive, standing before him. The man's knees gave way, and he sank to the floor, his breath coming in desperate gasps. The creature took a step forward, its claws scraping the floor like knives. And then it spoke, its voice a low, guttural whisper that seemed to crawl into his ears. "It's not over. Not until we're done." The storm outside raged louder, but within the cabin, everything went still. Time seemed to freeze. The creature took another step forward, and the man understood. He was never meant to escape. This was just the beginning. The darkness pressed in on him from all sides. The storm outside had become a deafening roar, the wind shrieking as if the very world itself was trying to tear him apart. But inside the cabin, it was still, silent. Only the shifting shadows and the low, rhythmic scrape of claws against wood marked the presence of the creature. The air had grown thick, suffocating with the weight of something ancient and malevolent, as if the very walls of the cabin were closing in on him. The man could feel it, the oppressive pressure growing heavier with each passing second. The creature's eyes, glowing with a cold, malevolent fire, never left him. It moved slowly, almost deliberately, as if savoring the terror it was instilling in him. Its body was a mass of shadows, shifting and writhing in ways that defied all logic, like a living nightmare. It wasn't just an entity of darkness. It was darkness itself, a presence so vast that it seemed to bend reality, making everything around it tremble in fear. The man's breath was shallow, his heart pounding in his chest as the creature drew closer, its claws clicking louder with every step. His limbs felt like they were made of stone, heavy and unresponsive. His body refused to move, his mind screaming at him to run, to fight, but his muscles refused to obey. He was trapped, a prisoner in his own cabin. The creature stopped just a few feet away from him, its glowing eyes narrowing as it studied him. There was something almost curious about the way it observed him, as if it were trying to understand him, trying to comprehend what kind of creature he was. But there was no sympathy in those eyes, no understanding. There was only hunger, the hunger of something that had been waiting, watching for a long time. "You're still here," the creature spoke, its voice a low, resonant growl that vibrated deep in his chest. The sound of it was unnatural, as if it came from the very core of the earth itself. "You think you've escaped. You think the nightmare is over, but you're wrong." The man's throat tightened, his voice trapped inside, but the creature didn't need him to speak. It already knew the truth. It knew everything. It had always known. "The pendant," the creature continued, its voice like ice scraping against his soul. "It was never meant to be destroyed. You can't stop what's coming, no matter how hard you try." The man's mind reeled. What was it talking about? He had destroyed the pendant. He had burned it. It had been the only thing keeping the nightmare at bay. But now the creature was telling him that it was all for nothing, that it hadn't been the pendant itself that had bound the darkness, but something deeper, something far more ancient and powerful than he had ever realized. "You were a fool to think you could control it," the creature rasped. "That pendant was just a trap, a lure to bring you here, to awaken me." A sickening realization hit the man like a wave crashing against the shore. The pendant had never been the key to the Wraith's prison. It had been the key to something much older, something that had been waiting for the right moment to break free. The creature took another step forward, its clawed feet scraping against the floor like a predator closing in on its prey. The man instinctively tried to push himself back, but his body was frozen, rooted to the spot by an unseen force. The air around him thickened, and the darkness seemed to grow heavier, suffocating him with its weight. You were never meant to survive, the creature continued, its voice now a whisper, but somehow louder than ever before. You think you're the first? You think you're the last? This has been happening for centuries. Generations have come and gone, all believing that they could end it. But the truth is, you're nothing but a pawn in a game much older than you can comprehend. The man's mind spun. A pawn. He was a part of something larger, something that had been unfolding long before he had ever set foot in this cursed cabin. The storm, the wraith, the fox, all of it had been part of a twisted design, a pattern he could never have understood. The creature's eyes glowed brighter, its presence overwhelming. The man could feel his consciousness begin to unravel, as if the darkness was not just surrounding him, but seeping into his very thoughts, tearing apart the fabric of his mind. His body trembled with the effort to resist it, but it was no use. The creature's power was too strong, too ancient. Do you feel it? The creature whispered, its voice almost tender now, like a lover's caress. The emptiness, the cold, the hunger. It's what you've been running from all this time, and it will never let you go. The man felt his chest tighten, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The cold had spread to his heart, his limbs, his very soul. The creature was right. He had been running from something far beyond his understanding, something that had been watching, waiting for centuries. And now it had him. You think this is the end? The creature hissed, its form shifting, flickering like a shadow in the firelight. But this is only the beginning. The darkness has always been here. It never left. And now it will consume you, all of you. The last of the warmth in the cabin seemed to evaporate as the creature stepped closer, its form blurring, distorting into something too terrible to name. The shadows it cast seemed to reach out, creeping along the floor, the walls, the very air itself, as if they were coming to life, ready to swallow everything in their path. The man's mind screamed, but no sound escaped his lips. He could feel the darkness closing in, like the cold hand of death wrapping around him, pulling him deeper into the void. He tried to resist, tried to break free, but it was too late. The creature had already won. With one final, chilling laugh, the darkness overtook him, drowning his thoughts, his will, his very existence. He was lost, and the storm outside raged on, as if the earth itself was in mourning. The cabin, once a place of warmth and shelter, had become a tomb. The wind outside howled louder, echoing across the empty snow-covered landscape. The man was gone. The creature's presence had consumed him, swallowed him whole, just as it had done countless others before. The fox, once a fierce guardian, had disappeared into the night, its role in this twisted game now over. And the darkness that had come to claim them all lingered, watching, waiting for the next soul to wander too close. And somewhere, deep within the earth, something older than time itself stirred, its hunger never satiated, its power never diminished. The cycle would continue, the storm would never end. The wind howled against the cabin, its shrill cries seeping through the cracks in the walls like the whispers of lost souls. The man's body lay motionless on the cold, hard floor, his face a mask of terror and disbelief. His final moments had been consumed by the creature's darkness, an ancient entity whose hunger could never be sated. Yet, as the storm raged outside, the cabin itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something more to unfold. The darkness, now fully awake, was not content. It was not finished. The room had grown unnervingly still, the fire long extinguished, leaving only the faintest glow from the dying embers. The shadows had stretched across the room, deepening and crawling along the edges of the walls, their forms distorted, twisted into unnatural shapes. They lingered like something sentient, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. A faint scraping sound broke the silence, barely audible over the shrieking wind outside. It was faint, but it was there, and then it came again, closer this time. the scraping of claws, as if something or someone was moving in the dark corners of the cabin. The shadows seemed to pulse with each sound, alive and aware, stirring with the promise of something sinister. And then, a faint light flickered. It was the faintest glow, but it cut through the darkness like a knife. The fox. It was standing just outside the door, its fur now a ghostly white against the backdrop of the storm. The animal's eyes were wide, its body tense, ears perked as it watched the doorway, as though it too was aware of the deepening threat in the cabin. There was no warmth in its gaze, no familiarity, just an intense awareness of the danger surrounding them. The fox was no longer the creature it had once been, no longer just a survivor, it was something more. It had become part of this place, part of the story that had unfolded within these cursed walls. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the fox vanished into the night, its ghostly form swallowed by the storm that raged outside. The man's lifeless body was the only thing left behind, but he wasn't alone. A strange shift occurred, subtle at first, as though the cabin was responding to the same ancient force that had driven the creature to hunt him. The shadows began to lengthen and twist in unnatural patterns, swirling and curling like a storm of darkness inside the cabin itself. The temperature dropped further still, each breath the man took feeling like icy daggers in his chest, despite his body no longer responding. The floorboards creaked, and then, from within the very walls, something began to stir. The air grew thick and heavy with the oppressive presence of something not meant to exist in the realm of the living. The shadows gathered, converging into the shape of something that should not have been. A figure emerged from the depths of the blackness. Its form was not solid. Its body seemed to shimmer in and out of reality, like a ghostly apparition, a creature whose shape existed in both the material world and the world beyond. The air around it crackled, alive with energy, as it took slow, deliberate steps toward the center of the room. Its face was hidden beneath a hood of darkness, the only visible part of its body being its hands, long clawed fingers that stretched out like the twisted branches of a tree, reaching for something or someone. It was not the wraith, it was something much older, something more powerful. The creature's presence seemed to distort the very fabric of the cabin. The walls trembled, the floorboards groaning under its weight. The air was thick with the acrid stench of decay and rot, as if the thing had come from the bowels of the earth itself, dragging with it the smell of death. It reached forward, the dark claws inches away from the man's body, hovering over him, a breath away from touching him, but it did not. It simply lingered, as if considering the man, as if debating whether to drag him into the void. And then, for the briefest of moments, the man's body moved. A shallow, involuntary breath escaped his lips, his chest rising and falling, as though something deep within him was struggling to return to life. The darkness seemed to pulse in response, reacting to the brief flicker of life. The creature froze, its attention sharpening as it realized something was happening, something had changed. The storm outside raged with a renewed intensity, the wind howling louder, pushing against the very foundation of the cabin. Inside, the figure hovered, its form flickering, its presence growing stronger, feeding off the man's flicker of life. The fox had vanished, but the storm was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. The man's eyes fluttered open, but his gaze was blank. He was alive, but not in the way he had once been. The darkness that had consumed him seemed to have left its mark, pulling him back from death in a twisted parody of life. His body felt foreign, as though it no longer belonged to him. His thoughts were slow, clouded, and he could hear the voice of the creature whispering in his mind, its presence filling the empty spaces of his consciousness. "It's not over," it whispered. "You were never meant to die. You're part of something much greater now." The man's body shuddered as if it were no longer his own, and for the first time he realized the full truth of the creature's words. The pendant, the fox, the storm, It had all been a part of something much bigger, something far older than he could ever comprehend. The walls of the cabin seemed to pulse with life, as if the very structure of the place had come alive in response to the presence of the creature. The shadows stretched, wrapping around him like a suffocating embrace, and then the creature's voice returned, this time in a low growl that vibrated the air around him. "You have awakened the forgotten." The man's blood ran cold at the words. What did it mean? What was the forgotten? The creature's hand reached down, its long claws brushing against his skin. The touch was cold, like ice against fire, sending waves of numbing terror through his veins. The shadows around him closed in tighter, and for a brief moment he could see beyond the veil of reality. A vision filled his mind, an ancient crumbling city buried beneath the earth, long forgotten by time. In the distance, towering figures moved through the ruins, their forms shadowed and monstrous, their eyes glowing with the same cold fire that burned in the creature's depths. They were creatures of darkness, ancient and unstoppable. "They are coming," the creature hissed, its voice echoing with 1,000 years of hunger. "The forgotten, they have waited, and now they will rise." The man's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. The storm outside, the wraith, the fox, it had all been leading to this. The darkness that had been unleashed had only been a precursor to the true horror. Something older, something far more terrifying, was rising. The forgotten were returning, and there was no escaping them. The shadows around him grew thicker, the air growing colder still. The man tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His body was no longer his own. He was bound, tethered to something far greater than he could comprehend. The darkness wrapped around him, and with each passing second he was drawn deeper into its grasp. And then the room fell silent once more. Outside, the storm howled on, its winds tearing through the night like the roar of a beast awakened from slumber. And in the cabin, the man was lost, swallowed whole by the ancient darkness that had come to claim him. The forgotten had risen, and there was no turning back. The storm had only just begun, and it would never end. The wind outside seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin, but within the silence was deafening. The man's form, once lifeless and pale, was now a twisted mockery of life, drawn into the grip of something far older, far more powerful. His eyes, once wide with terror, now shimmered with a strange, otherworldly glow, his body trembling as though his very soul was being pulled in two directions. His chest rose and fell, but it was no longer a human breath. It was something else, something alien, as if his body no longer belonged to him. The creature that stood before him, its long claws still hovering near his skin, had watched with cold, detached interest as the man struggled against the grasp of the darkness. Now it seemed to sense the shift in the air, the change that had taken place within him. The storm outside raged louder, as if it too felt the shift, as if the very world was holding its breath. "They are awakening," the creature whispered, its voice a low rasp, thick with the promise of something far more terrible. "The forgotten have been summoned, and they will not rest until they have taken everything." The words sent a shiver down the man's spine, though he was no longer certain if it was fear or something else, something darker that had begun to take root in his soul. The creature's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, then it turned, its form flickering like smoke, blending with the shadows that now seemed to coil and pulse around the cabin. Outside, the storm intensified, the wind screaming like the wails of the damned. The cabin seemed to groan in protest, as though it too was powerless against the force that was being unleashed. The temperature dropped further, the walls slick with frost as the shadowy figure moved toward the center of the room. It reached for the air itself, and in an instant, the shadows began to bend, to warp, as though they were being manipulated by an invisible hand. "The time has come," the creature muttered, its voice growing more distant, as though it was speaking to an audience that only it could see. "The forgotten will rise." And you will be their herald. The man's body jerked as though struck by an unseen force. His chest shuddered violently, and his hands clenched into fists, the muscles in his arms taut and trembling. His head fell forward, his mouth opening wide as though he was trying to scream, but no sound emerged. A dark mist began to swirl around him, tendrils of it snaking up his body, crawling beneath his skin like a living thing. The mist pulsed with an ancient energy, its power crackling in the air like static. Then something shifted. A low, guttural sound filled the air, like the creaking of ancient stone. The shadows around the man began to twist and warp, solidifying into shapes that could barely be described. They were figures, but not human, not animal. Just dark silhouettes, indistinct and shifting, their forms stretching unnaturally long, as if they existed in dimensions beyond the normal plane. They moved slowly, with purpose, toward the man. At first, he could not understand what was happening, what these creatures were. But as they drew closer, the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The Forgotten, those ancient beings that had slumbered for centuries, were beginning to take form once again. They had been waiting, hidden beneath the earth, in the corners of forgotten worlds, in the cracks of time itself. And now they were here. They had been awakened, summoned by the darkness that had consumed the cabin, by the force that had ensnared him. The creatures that emerged from the shadows were terrifying, their limbs stretched unnaturally long, ending in twisted, clawed hands. Their eyes burned with an unholy glow, and their skin was a patchwork of blackened veins and scars. They did not move like animals. They floated, drifting just above the ground, their bodies contorting and bending in ways that defied the laws of nature. Their mere presence seemed to warp the very air around them, distorting reality itself. The man's eyes darted around, his heart hammering in his chest, but he could not escape their gaze. He had become a part of something far greater than himself. He was no longer just a victim. He was an instrument of the darkness, the herald of the Forgotten. He had been drawn into their world, and now there was no turning back. The figure from earlier, the creature that had been watching him with such cold, detached interest, turned back toward him, its form flickering in and out of existence. Its claws glowed with a pale, sickly light, and its gaze fixed on the man with an intensity that was almost suffocating. "It is time," the creature said, its voice barely more than a whisper. "The ritual must be completed. The Forgotten must rise." The man's breath came in short, ragged gasps. He tried to move, to scream, to do anything to break free from the grip of the darkness, but his body betrayed him. He was no longer in control. The mist had fully enveloped him now, and with it came the realization that he had become part of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. His thoughts were no longer his own. His body, his very soul, had been claimed. The Forgotten were rising, and he was their vessel. The creatures gathered around him, their forms swirling, shifting, as though they were nothing but shadows themselves. The air grew heavy with a palpable sense of power, a force so ancient and unfathomable that it made the man's mind reel. The storm outside howled, the winds picking up as if they were celebrating the return of these dark beings. The man felt his body being pulled toward the center of the room, his limbs no longer moving of their own accord. He could feel the energy in the air, the hum of it vibrating through his very bones. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated, as the darkness inside him surged to life. The shadows seemed to grow more solid, more real, until they almost had a physical presence. They wrapped around him, pulling him into their fold, drawing him into a place where the laws of the living no longer applied. He was no longer just a man. He was becoming something else, a vessel for the Forgotten. The energy coursing through him, through his very veins, was overwhelming. It was ancient, primal, and it felt as though it could consume him completely. The creatures around him began to chant, their voices low and guttural, echoing through the cabin in a language that had not been spoken for millennia. The shadows flickered and writhed, taking on a life of their own, and the man felt the ground beneath him shift. The walls of the cabin seemed to blur, bending and stretching as the fabric of reality itself tore apart at the seams. Time and space seemed to bend, twisting and warping as the Forgotten prepared to rise, and then, in a single crushing instant, the darkness swallowed him whole. Outside, the storm raged on, the winds howling like a chorus of tortured souls. The trees outside bent beneath the force of the storm, their branches creaking in protest. The blizzard had become a maelstrom, a violent swirl of snow and ice that obscured everything. But inside the cabin, the darkness had taken root. The Forgotten had risen. The world would never be the same again. The man, now nothing more than a vessel for the ancient darkness, had become part of something much larger than himself, a force of nature that would sweep across the world, leaving nothing but destruction in its wake. The storm had only just begun, and it would never end. The Forgotten had awakened, and there was no turning back. The world outside the cabin had descended into madness. The storm raged with relentless fury, but within the walls of the cabin, the darkness had taken hold, weaving its web of corruption and despair. The Forgotten were now fully awakened, their presence so overwhelming that it distorted the very fabric of reality. The storm, once merely a harbinger, now felt like the embodiment of their power, uncontrollable and all-consuming. The man, his body now an empty shell, stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the terrifying figures of the Forgotten. His once familiar human form was now a twisted reflection of itself, as if his very essence had been absorbed into the ancient darkness. His eyes, wide and unblinking, glowed with the same unholy fire as the creatures that encircled him. His movements, once human and filled with fear, had become mechanical, devoid of life. The air in the cabin was thick with the weight of their presence. The shadows around him pulsed, alive with an energy that crackled and hummed, bending the light and distorting the room. The Forgotten loomed over him, their forms like living nightmares, figures of darkness that flickered in and out of existence, their monstrous forms indistinguishable from the very shadows they inhabited. It was clear now. The man had not been merely a victim of fate, he had been a catalyst. He had unwittingly triggered the rise of the Forgotten, pulling the world into a state of chaos and darkness. He had once been a person, a being of flesh and blood, but now he was nothing more than a vessel, a channel for the ancient evil that had waited for millennia. The creature that had first appeared to him, its dark, twisted form flickering in and out of the shadows, moved closer, its glowing eyes locked on the man. Its voice, a rasping whisper, filled the room. "You are no longer who you were." The creature's voice vibrated through the air, chilling and alien. "You are the harbinger now, the bridge between the Forgotten and the world of the living." As the words settled in the air, the man, if he could even still be called that, felt an icy, suffocating weight pressed down upon his chest. The darkness that had consumed him was not just a force of terror. It was a force of control, of manipulation, pulling the strings of fate as it had done for countless centuries. Outside, the storm intensified, the wind howling like an animal in pain, thrashing against the walls of the cabin. The cabin itself seemed to creak and groan, its structure bending under the pressure of the force that had settled within it. The temperature inside had plummeted to unnatural depths, frost creeping along the edges of the walls, the windows frozen in place, unable to shield the room from the growing force of the storm. And yet, there was something more, something stirring beneath the man's skin. The Forgotten were not just rising, they were transforming the world itself, bending it to their will. The storm was a manifestation of their power, but it was only the beginning. The man's thoughts, if they could still be called thoughts, were a blur. He could sense something deep within, a flickering light, a reminder of who he had once been, of the person he had been before the darkness overtook him. He grasped at the memories, trying to hold on to them, but they were fading, slipping through his fingers like sand. The darkness within him pushed back, consuming the remnants of his humanity, erasing the last vestiges of resistance. But deep within, a small part of him still remained. The storm outside, the rage of the forgotten, it was all a reflection of the conflict within him. He was the key, the vessel through which their power would fully manifest, but somewhere, buried beneath the layers of terror and darkness, there was still a spark of hope, a chance to fight, to resist. The forgotten had arrived. Yes, they had risen and spread their influence over the world. But could anyone still fight back? As if sensing his inner turmoil, the creature nearest him stepped forward. Its form flickered and shifted, its eyes burning with that unholy light. Its voice, low and hissing, slid into his mind. "Do you think you can escape?" it taunted. "There is no escaping the forgotten. There is only the embrace of the darkness, the eternal night that we will bring to this world." The man's chest heaved as he struggled to breathe, the weight of the creature's presence pressing down on him. But even as the darkness tried to swallow him whole, something deep within him flared to life. A small, quiet voice echoed in his mind, faint but persistent, a memory, a glimpse of the fox standing outside the cabin in the snow, its eyes full of wisdom and sorrow. The pendant, the fox, the storm, everything that had led him here, all of it had been a test. He had been a part of something greater, something beyond his comprehension, but his role wasn't over, not yet. The shadows around him began to writhe and snap, the forgotten growing restless. They could sense his defiance. They could feel the flicker of life within him, the small spark of resistance that had not yet been extinguished. In that moment, the man, now a vessel for the darkness, made a decision. He would not let himself be consumed. He would not become just another tool for the forgotten. The storm outside might rage with their power, but he would fight to hold on to the last shred of his humanity, to the last remnants of the light that flickered inside him. And so, as the forgotten drew closer, their forms closing in on him, he made his move. With every ounce of strength he could summon, he fought against the pull of the darkness, against the will of the creatures that sought to claim him completely. He wasn't sure what would happen, what the consequences of his defiance would be, but in that final moment, he knew one thing for certain: he could not allow this to be the end. Not yet. The forgotten might have risen, but he would not let them rule the world without a fight. A battle was coming, and the storm outside was only the beginning. The man's struggle, his resistance, echoed across the cabin. The forgotten halted for a moment, sensing the shift in the air. For a brief instant, the world seemed to hold its breath. Could this be the turning point? Could he, against all odds, defy their grasp? The answer would come soon, but for now the storm continued to rage, its howls a chorus of the darkness that had only just begun to make its mark on the world. And in the heart of the storm, the man stood alone. The forgotten were watching. The world was about to change. The cabin trembled as if it were alive, its walls shaking under the immense weight of the storm that raged outside. The winds howled, and the shadows inside writhed like living entities, feeding off the terror that hung in the air. The forgotten had awakened fully, their dark presence suffocating every corner of the room. But amidst the chaos, the man, the vessel, stood at the center, his body trembling as the last remnants of his humanity clung to him. The shadows closed in around him, but something had changed. There was a shift in the air, something palpable. The forgotten could feel it. For the first time since they had arrived, the creatures faltered. The air grew heavier, charged with an energy that threatened to repel them. The storm outside seemed to echo the tension within, as if nature itself was reacting to the man's struggle. The forgotten, though powerful beyond imagination, could not deny the disturbance. They sensed the flicker of defiance that still burned within the man, his refusal to fully surrender to them. The creature that had watched him from the beginning, the one that had guided the darkness into his soul, stepped forward. Its eyes gleamed with the cold light of ancient knowledge. The creature was no longer just an observer, it was the leader of the forgotten, their master and harbinger. "You still resist?" it whispered, its voice thick with an eerie satisfaction. "But it is futile. The darkness has claimed you, and there is no escape. We are the end of everything, the beginning of nothing. You are nothing but a tool to usher in our dominion." The man's body sagged, and for a fleeting moment it seemed like the darkness had won. The coldness inside him spread like ice through his veins. The shadows wrapped around him, pulling at his limbs, seeking to drain him of every last trace of resistance. The forgotten pressed closer, their movements fluid and sinister, filling the room with an overwhelming presence. The storm outside howled louder, the fury of the wind like a call to the ancient ones. Yet within the suffocating grip of the shadows the man felt it, a pulse, faint but undeniable, a flicker of light in the depths of the darkness. The fox. Its eyes had never left him, even in the most terrifying of moments. The animal had been more than just a creature of survival. It had been a guide, a beacon, a reminder that even in the darkest of places, there could be a glimmer of hope. In that fleeting moment of clarity, the man's breath caught in his throat. The fox had shown him the way, had led him to this point of decision. It had not been a coincidence. The pendant, the storm, the darkness, it was all connected. The fox had been sent to prepare him, to give him the strength to fight back. The man's eyes snapped open, his body, now weak and on the edge of being consumed, found a renewed surge of strength. The dark mist that had once enveloped him like a shroud began to recede, retreating into the corners of the room, as though it could no longer hold him in its grasp. His hands clenched into fists, the claws of the forgotten now far away. There was no time to waste. With a strangled cry, he pushed against the darkness, summoning the last of his will. The shadows trembled in response. The air charged with a growing energy. The forgotten screeched, their forms flickering in and out of existence as they realized something had changed. The creature that had led them, the one with the cold eyes, recoiled, its face contorting with frustration and fury. "Impossible," it hissed. "You cannot." But the man was already moving. His body, though weak, was fueled by the very force that had once tried to consume him. The force of the forgotten, the darkness that had sought to shape the world. And now, he wielded it, not as a victim, but as a weapon. The fox's presence had awakened the spark within him, the will to survive, to defy the ancient evil that had long ago claimed the earth. The shadows trembled violently, as if struggling against his newfound resolve. They writhed and shrieked, unable to contain him any longer. The storm outside seemed to pause, the wind holding its breath as the man, now fully aware of his power, turned his gaze toward the leader of the forgotten. "No more," he whispered, his voice echoing with an authority that sent chills down the spine of the creature before him. With a single determined step, the man thrust his hand forward. The pendant around his neck, the last tether to his humanity, began to glow with an intense, pure light. The shadows recoiled, as though they were being burned by the very light that had once seemed so distant. The room filled with a brilliant flash, a light so blinding that it pushed back the darkness in waves, shattering the hold that the forgotten had on the cabin. The creatures shrieked in agony as the light intensified. Their forms flickered and twisted, their screams growing louder, echoing through the very fabric of the world. They could not withstand the power of the light, the force that had been awakened by the man's defiance. The forgotten were not invincible, not in the face of hope, not in the face of resistance. The leader of the forgotten lunged toward the man, its claws extended, but it was too late. The light exploded from the pendant, a radiant force that consumed everything in its path. The creature's screech cut off abruptly as it was enveloped by the brilliance, its form disintegrating into nothingness, swallowed by the light that had risen from within the man. The shadows in the room collapsed, writhing and twisting until they vanished, their influence fading as the light continued to pulse. The storm outside faltered, the winds dying down, as though the world itself had exhaled in relief. The temperature in the cabin slowly returned to normal, the oppressive cold lifting as the last remnants of the darkness were banished. The man stood, breathing heavily, his body trembling from the exertion, his vision blurred, but he remained standing, his hand still raised, the pendant glowing softly at his chest. The air was still, the storm outside now a mere whisper against the silence within the cabin. The forgotten were gone. But the man knew this victory came at a cost. The storm, the darkness, it had all been part of something far greater, something that had tried to tear the world apart. He had won, but he was changed. The light had consumed him just as much as it had consumed the shadows. He had become part of something much larger, something that he would never fully understand, but that was the price of survival. The fox's presence lingered in his mind, its eyes still watching, guiding him even now. The storm had ended, but the journey was far from over. The man stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on the door. He would leave the cabin now. The world was waiting, and it was a world that had changed. There was still so much to do. The forgotten had risen, but they had been cast down. And somewhere, deep within the shadows, something else waited, something that could not be defeated so easily. The storm had passed, but the story was not over. And in the distance, something whispered on the wind, a voice from the past, a voice of the forgotten. The darkness would return, and this time, it would not be so easily defeated. The end, or is it just the beginning?